Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and thank you for taking the time. I want to say good morning from Boston, where I am. Good evening or afternoon to wherever you are. My name is Donisha Thaxton, and I am Carney Sandoe's Associate Director of Conferences, and I also lead our placement group in diversity, equity, and inclusion searches. And today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Monique W. Morris. As you settle in to listen and learn, hear these words. Dr. Morris embodies everything we want in the world: courage, love, and justice. We couldn't imagine a better leader. Or how about this? Dr. Monique Morris has dedicated her life to being an accomplice in building the power of girls of color. These are direct quotes from Dr. Morris's colleagues at Grantmakers for Girls of Color, a philanthropic collaborative that supports all girls and young women of color and helps to dismantle structural barriers created by racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression, for which she is the inaugural Executive Director. Dr. Morris is also the founder of the National Black Women's Justice Institute, an organization that works to interrupt the school to confinement pathways for girls, reduce the barriers to employment for formerly incarcerated women, and increase the capacity of organizations to reduce sexual assault and domestic violence in African-American communities. Dr. Morris is an award-winning scholar, author, and filmmaker. She is the executive producer and co-writer of the documentary film currently airing on PBS, Pushout, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, which is based upon two of her books, Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, Education for the Liberation of Black and Brown Girls, and Pushout, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools. For 3 decades, she has worked with schools, civil rights organizations, nonprofits, public agencies, and activists to advance policies and practices that promote racial and gender equity. Dr. Morris's work is multifaceted and uses research and narratives to challenge actions and structures of oppression. From her 2018 TED Talk on how to stop the criminalization of Black girls in schools, which has been viewed by millions, to her lectures honoring the life and legacy of the artist Prince, we all have something to learn from Dr. Morris. We are so honored to welcome her to our 7th annual Forum Diversity. And Dr. Morris, please take it away.
Thank you so much. I was not expecting to hear those words from my team at G4GC, so now I'm all in my feelings. Thank you for that. I'm thrilled to be here with you all. The opportunity to share the body of work that I've been building over time is always a privilege, and I'm so happy that there are those of you out in our community that are willing to process this deep inquiry with me about what it is that is our duty in this time, and how we move forward to advance structures of equity beyond rhetoric. I would also like to offer that, I come to this work from a variety of experiences. I come to this work as a researcher, I come to this work as a mother of girls, I come to this work as a former educator, I come to this work as someone who is just deeply committed to recognizing what our possibility is, particularly when we engage through a lens of justice. And so much of what I wanted to share with you today, as you're thinking about the work that you intend to do, that the skills you're intending to build, and the possible interactions that you'll have with students who represent a host of different identities. Just this notion that everything that I offer to you is something that I'm deeply personally committed to, and everything that I offer to you is a constant meditation and practice on my own. And so I want us to consider ourselves in this work together, and not me lecturing to you, although that's the structure and format of the moment. I'm sorry that we can't be with each other in person. This is the next best thing for us to at least have some form of community. I'm going to offer some comments to you, but I'd also like to invite you, if you have questions, to put those in the Q&A. And there will be some time toward the end where I'm hopeful that I can respond to some of the direct questions that you might have as I'm walking through my presentation with you and talking to you about some of these things. I know that many of you are looking at working with independent high schools, boarding schools, charter schools, et cetera. I also, wanted to say that I come to this work having been educated in independent schools and had the experience of walking through halls as a Black girl in an independent school, and also being in community as a parent with an independent school, and as an alumni, a relatively active alumni in schools around how the unique location and structure of independent institutions can inform this conversation that we're having more broadly about equity, and some of the things that I think are critically important. I was really thrust back to being 18 years old myself when I was preparing for this and thinking about the work and remembering what it was to be graduating. I was nominated by my peers to be a student representative to speak at graduation. And I remember, making the decision at the time to give a talk about how the school that I was attending and graduating from could be more responsive to its students of color. And, my mother will tell you that I've always been committed to these issues and somehow involved in them. But I remember standing there and talking, and I think I titled the speech, Stop, Look, Listen, and Act. And I remember I was inspired by an old R&B song that was about stop, look, listen to your heart. But as a high school student, I didn't want anyone to know that I listened to oldies, and also was pretty clear that there was a lesson and a wisdom embedded in this notion that if you pause for a second and engage and listen to those who are living and experience, that there's another way of knowing that we can use to amplify what it is that's important to our communities, but also how we can, transform those very communities. The projects that I've been involved in through literature or through film have largely been about building upon the wisdoms that we gain from our arts, and really thinking about how that can move us toward more rigorous conversations. We're just coming, this is the week that so much has happened. It's the week of the MLK weekend, straight into inauguration, where now we have our first woman of color as vice president for the United States. We are in a moment of transition and potential transformation. That is something that we see taking place at the national level, certainly brings many of us excitement and hope, but it's also something that should give us a moment to reflect upon what it is that we want and how we build out those structures such that they do more than just say that they are locations for equity and actually become and function as such. So much of my work has been rooted in this conversation about criminalization, because for me and for a number of scholars who have been engaged in work around equity and work around racial justice, the conversation about criminalization has made its way into just about every other aspect of life for people of African descent in this country, and increasingly for other communities of color. The work that we do specific to women and girls, or that we've done specific to women and girls, has tried to just expand the conversation such that it can be inclusive of individuals who express their identity across a spectrum of gender, or who are uniquely impacted by systems and structures in a way that usually flies under the radar, because much of our national public discourse is really about the conditions of men and boys of color, particularly in this conversation about criminalization. So in Pushout, the criminalization of Black girls in schools, it was really about identifying all the ways that our educational institutions, mostly in the public domain, inform the risk of future contact with the juvenile court or criminal legal system. And I spent a lot of time talking about the policies, practices, conditions, and prevailing consciousness that renders young people vulnerable to future contact with the juvenile court or criminal legal system. And much of that is because there's not a lot of data for independent schools, and there's not a lot of data that, or conversation happening about ways that the prevailing consciousness of criminalizing Black and brown bodies is pervasive in those spaces. But I'm so thrilled to be able to talk to you all about that, because I think it's an important part of the conversation. It's an important missing element, and independent schools, charter schools, boarding schools are not immune to engaging in many of the functions that render our girls of color uniquely vulnerable to not just a life of being criminalized or unfairly punished, but rendering them invisible in many ways. And one of the things that we have established early on in the advocacy community around women and girls of color was that erasure is another form of violence, and neglect is another form of violence. So when I'm talking about Pushout and criminalization and all these big issues, you know, a lot of what I'm talking about are the policies, practices, conditions, and the prevailing consciousness, as I said before, that render young people vulnerable to future contact with the juvenile court or criminal legal system. Much of how we've understood that in the past has really been about the citations that occur on a school campus that might lead directly to a young person being brought to the juvenile court. But in my work with girls and in the growing body of work that's been looking at what's possible with our young people, we've seen that it also includes, you know, the overrepresentation among young people in discipline that renders them vulnerable to being suspended or expelled, which leads them to increase contact with the juvenile court or criminal legal system, high stakes testing that can push students away, the increase in surveillance on and off campuses, dress code policies and other codes of conduct that can lead to adultification and dehumanization, and poor educational and life outcomes. In my experience and in the body of work that we've been building, you know, I think it's really important for us to explore this notion of adultification in particular as it relates to Black girls who are uniquely experiencing adultification. There is the brilliant work of Dr. Jamelia Blake that partnered with the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality to give us a study that looked at how Black girls are uniquely impacted by adultification. And in that study, they talked about the fact that Black girls are basically being received as more adult-like than they actually are by the adults who work with them. That when Black girls are as young as age 5, they start to be read as more adult-like, meaning they're believed to need less comforting, less protection, less nurturing, that they are believed to know more about adult subject matter like sex, and to be more independent than their white counterparts. This can have really important and devastating outcomes for Black girls who then are stripped of their capacity to be girls. They are unfairly punished because of how their bodies are developing, particularly when we know that Black girls are experiencing disproportionately the early onset of puberty. And there is this way in which Black girls, because they are being adultified, are seen as intentionally or willfully participating in activities that others may be given more leeway or more opportunity to recover from because it's seen as a part of their normal adolescent development. These are important developments in our own learning around adultification, but also it doesn't mean that once we know that Black girls are experiencing unique adultification that we then you know, move into business as usual, but just with the additional knowledge. It means that we actually have to engage in a call to action around what policies or practices we're engaging in our own classrooms, in our own schools, that might render Black girls uniquely vulnerable to this kind of perception about their bodies, this kind of perception about their activities, and their perception, our perceptions then about their promise. It's all a work in development, but one thing that I think is critical is that we begin to explore how we rectify this scenario. And it's something that I'd spend a lot of time with in Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues. And I wanted to locate the conversation about recovery and about schools as locations for healing in the context of our musical traditions, because number one, I love music. And I also believe that music is healing and music is the past, present, and future. But I also really recognize that if we pay attention to the lessons that are embedded in our artistic traditions, that's where we start to see some of the other wisdoms that can seep into the more propositional knowing that we tend to privilege in everyday society. Singer Rhythm Dance the Blues talks about schools becoming locations for healing and actually spends time giving examples of locations that I have visited across the country and in other parts of the world that are demonstrating how this takes place. So in this is an invitation to explore why we should pull students in closer when they're in crisis rather than push them away. Within many of our structures, it's easy, particularly in independent schools, to hide the fact that we push young people of color away. There's not the same requirements around public reporting. There are not the same requirements around an articulation of justice. And where I've seen independent schools in some ways be more rigorous around the inclusion of some practices that can serve as alternatives to suspension and expulsion because they do have that discretion. It's also a location where we have, in some ways, a false invitation for the students of color to be engaged in rigorous discourses, and yet a failed capacity of the institution to fully respond and embrace those as legitimate, actionable calls to action or actionable items or calls for a shift in change policy, in changed behaviors, and in a changed consciousness. And so the conversation that I think we should continue to have is to recognize that we're doing this in so many ways, intentionally sometimes and unintentionally in other ways. The elevation of a conversation about schools becoming more trauma responsive is also critically important at this time. It's deeply important for our schools to really think about how we become more than just trauma informed, that being informed of the presence of trauma is just a first step, that really what we're trying to do is build out healing spaces so that they are responsive to the trauma that our young people are disproportionately experiencing, and such that we as educators can move forward with the development of classrooms that are not what I call maladaptive classrooms, which is really born from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's work around childhood, adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma, where she talks about this unintentional or unintended way in which some of our structures exacerbate harm in the lives of young people who have experienced trauma. In so many ways, there are classroom structures are becoming maladaptive in the sense that if they are disproportionately focused on punishment, disproportionately focused on responding to young people's trauma with more violence and or erasure or victimization, then we're actually causing greater harm. And we don't have to be. I really do think that it's important for us to think about schools as locations for healing, not just because it's a way for us to respond to some of the other crises that are taking place in schools. And I certainly, understand that educational institutions have their own challenges with that. But it's also really important to understand the school as a function, as a critical function and institution in society, and that where schools can fill in for young people in order for them to feel safe enough to learn, we should be doing that. That we should be thinking about not filling our schools with law enforcement or what I call instruments of surveillance and Pushout and Singer Rhythm Dance the Blues, but rather really think about how we map the margins for our most vulnerable students so that our engagement with intersectionality becomes more than just a theoretical proposition or an intellectual exercise, but really is infused in how we measure the impact of our actions, measure the impact of our policies, and also just in general, how we measure success. Many of our schools do have the resources and capacity to have counselors, but many still don't have counselors and clinicians and other youth development specialists who can work with young people who are in crisis. And this is something that everybody can use. One of the big elements that we lift up in the film Pushout is that everyone has an ACE score, right? It doesn't matter who you are. All of us have been exposed to some degree of potential childhood disruption. Now, what makes the difference is who has access to sort of structures and individuals who can help build resiliency, and how we're measuring resiliency, how we're recognizing it among our young people, and what we do when we see this play out. For many Black girls, the way that they demonstrate their resilience is then perceived as being combative. And I talk a little bit about that being rooted in some of the historical tropes and stereotypes about Black girlhood that render it vulnerable to being interpreted as loud or sassy or combative, willfully defiant in a way that can cause greater harm, when in fact what they're doing is standing up to an oppression that they recognize as being deeply harmful to them and calling us in to be responsive to that. And in this notion of calling people in, you know, a lot of folks have been using that as a framework to think about diversity or to think about equity. You know, for me, and I think, and I hope you take this, I think equity is ultimately about how we dismantle structures of oppression. Now, we can't talk about equity and healing unless we are ready to fully engage in the rigorous analysis that's required for us to think about what policies, institutions, practices, and prevailing thoughts and ideas have been causing harm to the communities most deeply impacted by these ideas. And that when we're thinking about this, we have to then hold ourselves accountable and develop metrics and standards and sort of the rigors around the development of rubric that really invite us into thinking about how we restructure our understanding of the capacity of education. So equity is not about diversity training. Equity is not about being aware of the various cultural practices of different groups. Equity is about dismantling structures of oppression that deny people systematically from participating fully as their whole selves, that deny people the freedom to be healing centered, that deny people the freedom to explore, and that ultimately deny our students the opportunity to be the scholars that we know they can be. So, you know, it's interesting because so many of our young people are just keenly aware of how these institutions are functioning, to either protect them, to engage them, to support them, or to deny them opportunities. And many of our institutions are designed through this hierarchical structure that you know, invites young people to maybe have a little bit of a say in what the climate is for the school, but really that's designed by the adults who are leaders of the school. And, you know, I just propose to you to think about co-constructing classrooms, co-constructing rules and spaces with young people that invite them into a deeper exploration of what they want and how they want it. Sometimes that also means we have to be very much aware of how we are engaged in the teaching, right? The pedagogical practices that we're using. And it's critically important for us to build curricula and other school-based structures that don't teach explicitly and only to the oppression of these students. If the only time you're hearing about yourself is in the context of how your community was disproportionately harmed, or the only way you are engaged in the conversation is for you to explore your community from a deficit model, then that has a deep lasting impact on the psyche, on your psyche, but also the psyche of other students who may not have had routine exposure to the resilience and beauty of your community. And it's really important to think about that, particularly in independent schools, which tend to be disproportionately populated by white students, more affluent families, those who have either participated or whose families have participated in the oppression of communities of color or benefited from that oppression. And you know, I know it may be difficult to process. It's important for me to say that as an alum, as a parent, and again, as someone who has watched various systems negotiate power and privilege in a way that calls us into a more rigorous examination of what education can be and what collective liberation means. Understanding the importance of dismantling structures of oppression is as important for affluent families as it is for those who are living in poverty. These are conversations we have to have across the board. Understanding that students of color are not there to fill quotas or to be othered or fetishized, and being aware as adults that students are participating in some of these activities is critically important for us to establish norms, language, culture that invites people into a bridging of how we combat the things that I've been talking about, the criminalization, the adultification, the ultimate dehumanization that can leave students feeling othered in their own learning spaces. You know, what I love about, you know, many of these schools is that we're able to have the kinds of rigorous, deep intellectual thought that, you know, is encouraging critical thought and engagement in ways that many other schools, particularly those that may be low performing schools, don't necessarily get to have. And sometimes the privilege of having these deep intellectual conversations means that we can also design curricula that can speak to intersectionality in a more intentional way, and that can provide an opportunity for our young people to express themselves across the spectrum of learning and across the different modalities that can lead us to understanding who we are and who we want to be, and the skill sets that are required, I think, for us to prepare this next generation of leaders. It's also really important to think about our schools as we reimagine them as these locations for healing, to be places where when young people make mistakes, that we don't push them away from us. One of the things that I do uplift in the TED Talk that I mentioned earlier was that it's really important for us to think about when a child is in crisis, that is actually the time where we shouldn't push them away. We should bring them in closer rather than saying, you have nothing to do with our community anymore. And so what does it mean to pull people in closer? It means that we have to really think about not only how we are responding to a young person in that moment, but how we are building up a capacity of the community to recognize that they are one of us. And that if they are one of us and they are hurting in whatever way that is, that we have to take the time to work on the process of dismantling the structure of oppression that has deeply informed that harm or that hurt. You know, that means that there have to be safe spaces to do that kind of work, right? That don't disproportionately negatively impact or place an unfair burden on the students of color in that space, where we can use our curriculum and the books that we read and the conversations that we facilitate and how we, you know, introduce even some complex, you know, mathematical or scientific equations to a classroom in a way that invite, you know, this idea that all of us have been part of this grand narrative of human development, and that it is not located in a single community, or the expertise isn't located in a single community, but rather this knowledge that is distributed. And in the affinity spaces that can exist, it's really important for them to certainly engage in the rigors around dismantling white privilege and talking through all of these contexts of power, but also to think about, again, the volunteers, the counselors, and, you know, the relationships that can lead to more empathetic responses when young people are exhibiting symptoms of trauma or having disruptions in their lives. Also, you know, including yoga, mindfulness, restorative approaches. These are all really important too, as we think about, you know, what our next iteration of schooling is going to look like. And this is going to be more deeply important when young people start to return to schools than ever before, I believe, because where, you know, institutions could pretend that, you know, they didn't necessarily know some of the collective traumas that communities are experiencing. We really can't do that anymore, right? I didn't think it was appropriate before, but it's certainly not appropriate now. And there's also this collective trauma of living through this COVID era, where all of us have been, you know, detached from our communities. We've had differential engagement around, you know, some of these critical issues. The educators are trying to continue to teach, students are trying to continue to learn, and we're still all feeling a certain tension around how we all ultimately can be well and how we can move in a way that ultimately is not with fear, even if that is a fear of not getting into the best college or not getting into the institution that you have been dreaming of all your life, but rather with love, and for that love to be rooted in a sense of community that is also a deep interrogation of power. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is one that he offered in 1968, and that I typically engage at the start of some of my talks around how we use our power. He offered that power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice is using power to correct everything that stands against love. And it's this cyclical, reciprocal way that power and love operate that make all the difference in the world, right? We may not have the power as educators to transform policies in the grander sense of the word, although I think there are obviously ways to do that. But we do have the power to influence the decision-making and engagement within the classrooms that we are facilitators of learning in, and how we are constructing, some of the rubrics for language used in that classroom, how we are thinking about engaging our young people and young scholars in deeper conversations about how they're interpreting historical events, how they are interpreting contemporary events, how we are thinking about our connection to the global community. These are all deeply rigorous ideas that I think we shouldn't have to wait till grad school to engage. You can start these conversations when young people are in pre-K. You can start these conversations about our global connection to each other, our understandings for each other, this conversation about equity and engagement and inclusive, thinking. These are themes that can operate, across the educational spectrum at every educational level. And we have to think about it not just being about our own individual actions. We have to think about it as a structural issue. And so, when we think about social movements, King also offered to us that a social movement that only moves people is a revolt. A social movement that changes both people and institutions is a revolution. And what we're after now is the laying of a framework for us to address revolutionary thought and engagement, transformative thinking about equity and engagement, and ultimately the dismantling of structures of oppression that continue to cause harm. Schools should be part of the tapestry of healing, in my mind. And that's my primary argument for the papers and books and other publications that I put forth. It's really ultimately this call for us to see education as a tool for liberation, and to do that by launching schools as locations for healing so that they can be locations for learning. And recognizing that when a school is a location for healing, then young people who are experiencing trauma can recover from that and be in community. That the isolation, competitive way of engaging with each other, that while a certain degree of competition is healthy, a lot of the type of competition that we see manifest in some of our learning institutions really breeds a type of commitment to inequity, to dishonesty. And much of that is rooted in, sensibilities that will be ultimately a disservice to young people who are seeking to move in a global economy, and who are seeking to move in spaces that really reflect a deeper understanding of our human connection. So there's an opportunity before us, and this is the meditation for me for the past 5-6 years is really about how we will use our power. Will we root our examination and exercise of power in the politics of fear, or will we root our power in what we understand to be love? And how we as educators then move forward and find institutions and seek to transform institutions for learning, such that they really ultimately support young people's capacity to develop those skills, and how we as adults develop those skills alongside them. It's really important to recognize that this is not just a a sort of situation where you get a certificate and a hat and you're good to go, right? You're certified as culturally competent. That's not how it goes. It's really a continuum, and one that is about continuous learning and development. Being clear about that with young people is essential. Being clear about that with yourself is essential. We're all on this journey, and it's about our commitment to do that intentional personal work and to use that personal work to transform systems and structures such that they do not cause harm. That is where we start to get to some of the real work that needs to happen to uplift equity. So I'll pause. I'm looking at our time and I see we have about 20 minutes left. And so I'll go to the Q&A. Feel free to add questions in there as you like. And I'll start with this one that says, thank you for speaking about the idea of erasure as violence. Do you think this erasure is just an effect of media, or is it a part of Black girls' treatment within Black communities as well? The work that I've been doing and what the participatory research that I've been leading and that my colleagues have been leading and that G4GC has been resourcing in some ways do suggest certainly that the erasure that Black girls are uniquely experiencing is both a function of media, but also absolutely embedded within Black communities as well. The idea of intersectionality is that we cannot function in a way that privileges one identity over another, right? Audre Lorde taught us that there's no hierarchy of oppressions, right? And we have to think about how the intersection between multiple identities and experiences really impact our relationships with institutions, communities, and individuals. That's what intersectionality, as described by Kimberly Crenshaw, is ultimately about. And so when we're thinking about these multiple identities, we're thinking about the fact that Black girls are absolutely Black, but they never stop being girls. And so they're dealing with sexism at the same time that they're dealing with racism. And so the erasure that has taken place for Black girls has largely been perpetuated by multiple communities. Certainly this conversation about the unique and almost exclusive conversation about the unique needs of men and boys of color has presented a space, particularly in Black communities, where Black men and boys and the harms that they experience in society become the only talking point. I came to this work specifically around Black girls because we were in spaces where I found myself too often raising my hand to say, what about the girls? What about the girls? What about the girls? Because I was clear that in many of our learning spaces and certainly in our communities, Black girls were experiencing the same kind of surveillance, living with the same conditions as their male counterparts. That Black non-binary young people and gender expansive young people were also dealing with these conditions, and yet we were rendering them as somehow niche or not worthy of deep inquiry. And so, I think it is both a function of the public discourses, but also as it is playing out in communities. We can shift these discourses. So, that's what's most exciting to me about this notion of narrative. Is it's powerful, can certainly be a dominant way that we come to understand an issue, but that's something that we can control. So thinking about power, we can control the narrative. We can think about how we depict certain issues. We can frame things differently. We can work with young people so that they have a space to articulate their lived experiences in a way that can shift people's thinking. And it's become evident to me in the work around Pushout that this is possible, but it's certainly become evident to me in other ways around COVID, where, certainly early on, we thought, we knew there was going to be a disparate impact. And I knew, certainly just from experience, that much of the public rhetoric would not talk specifically about the ways that girls of color were uniquely going to be impacted by this pandemic. And especially given that they were in fact living at the intersection of multiple pandemics, with racial injustice being another significant health crisis that has continued to impact communities of color. in this nation and globally, and thinking about the impacts on the global South. And so it has really, been something that that I think can be used as a tool for us to think about, and or as a framework for us to think about how we begin to collect information in participatory ways from young people who are living in these experiences, and how we prepare various media assets that can help shape how people are coming to understand this issue. For the first time, I think, this summer, when there were many demonstrations protesting, what was going on with respect to law enforcement's negative history and engagement with Black communities, we saw, the attempt certainly to erase Breonna Taylor from the conversation about George Floyd, but the community more than ever would not allow that to happen. And that continuing to engage in the development of a capacity for folks to hold both a racial and gender analysis is really a critical part of this work. It's work that is developed by those who choose to become ethnic studies or gender studies majors, but it doesn't have to be. It's something that we can certainly begin to invest in at earlier ages, such that our young people do not have to undo some of their thinking around these issues, but rather can build from a more equitable intersectional analysis as they move through their educational experience. The second question I have, as you talk about adultification in schools, I'm thinking about the stories we're reading about how our healthcare system fails to understand the needs of Black people, and both stories speak to a bigger anti-Black culture in the US. How do you see the bigger cultural phenomena play out in schools? Anti-Blackness is one of the biggest issues that we have to deal with, I think. And it's one of the reasons why I include, when I talk about trauma, I include historical trauma. Oftentimes when we have ACE studies, or we think about adverse childhood experiences or childhood traumas, we divorce that incident-based understanding of trauma from the collective unresolved trauma of our ancestors, and that's a problem. It's a problem because the unresolved collective grief from the generations of harm that have produced what we now understand and recognize as anti-Blackness, which was always anti-Blackness, anti-Africanness, is something that has shipped out throughout the world. It has participated in the dehumanization of Black bodies, the way that Black bodies are read as problematic in society, and the ways that individuals who are closer to a representation of Blackness in skin tone and otherwise become problematic in the American consciousness, or in sometimes even in our global consciousness. And we have to heal from that. We have to reconcile that. We have to talk about it. When President Biden made the comment about needing to address white supremacy in his inauguration remarks, many of us who have been scholars in this work were pleasantly surprised that a president would stand before his community and say, this is something that we have to address. And not just to say, that it's something that we have to address and then move on, but then to begin to establish structures even within his own administration to address some of these issues, so that we have now in the Domestic Policy Council a dedicated position that will be looking at racial justice. We have the Gender Policy Council that will include special assistants that are looking at Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who identify as women and girls. It is really important to establish priorities for sure, but it is also really important to recognize that as we explore some of these inequities that we know to cut across systems, that we design an opportunity for us to engage agencies in the same kind of rigorous analysis. One of the things that schools become some of the unfortunate purveyors of some of this anti-Blackness in ways that I certainly explore as it impacts Black girls in Pushout, the film and the book, but I also really think that it's important for us to explore how this anti-Blackness is portrayed in our pedagogical approaches to learning, our elevation of certain ways of knowing, a deep examination of how dissent is expressed and what we do in response to that. Anti-blackness is certainly at the root of much of why we see the disparities in discipline, school discipline, because it's certainly not only Black children who are making mistakes in schools, certainly, but unfortunately, Black children are the ones who are disproportionately experiencing the harsher punishments because of it. It's at the root of adultification. It's at the root of a lot of social inequities in this country, and they come together in ways that present deeply harmful narratives that we are seeking to shift intentionally, and that we have the capacity to shift if we align our actions with those intentions. Do you have a book list for students or faculty that highlights the resilience and beauty of the Black community and Black girls specifically? There is a beautiful book by Venus Evans Winters called Teaching Black Girls that I love, that is very specific to faculty. Also, Michelle Foster's Black Teachers on Teaching is very interesting and highlights resiliency and beauty of the Black community. There are a host of books that highlight the beauty of the Black community, mostly taught by Black authors. And so that's or written by Black authors. And so it's really important to explore, particularly those English departments, but other departments as well, to make sure that the reading that is done and the exploration of what is the American narrative is not treating the story of resilience in Black and Brown communities as electives, but rather as a critical core part of the learning, such that everyone can be exposed to those narratives and that it can inform so much of what we do. What are some ways an elementary educator can utilize to engage students in issues about diversity and equity that they can clearly grasp? I guess that's how best to teach them to be global citizens. Okay, so I think the question is really about how do elementary educators help in the cultivation of global citizens or young people who identify as global citizens. I taught my daughters to be global citizens very early on, and I had the ability to do that because they were learning a second language. They were learning French, and I wanted to ensure that as they were learning their second language, that they were in a space where they could recognize all the ways that that language would open doors for them, not just in terms of their own personal advancement, but the collective advancement. We talk in elementary school a lot about sharing and community, and then sometimes it starts to diminish over time. We start talking about sharing and we start getting really individualized in our approaches to engage. With elementary educators, I think you have the unique capacity to prime young people for global engagement because we know that our young folks are such sponges at that time. Giving them assignments that provide them with an opportunity to watch films from different communities, to engage in conversations or watch videos from new lands. We have available to us, a host of technologies that invite that kind of conversation, but also really understanding that young people uniquely understand this concept of fairness. And so having real conversations that certainly invite them to share who they are and some of the traditions in their families. A lot of curricula include the development of family trees, and invite young people, to come in and talk about who they are and what their experiences have been. But it's also really important to read books that really do elevate the truths of the American landscape, and that really invite them to have conversations with each other about fairness in that space. And it doesn't always have to be about your own, sort of lived experience and community. I think it's really important for us to think about, how the arts can introduce some of these ideas, how, certainly, as I said, literature can introduce some of these ideas, but also, how the concepts we're introducing in science and math can elevate the contributions of other communities that are non-European communities that, really demonstrate how communities have contributed to, or how our global community has come together for a very long time, even as we were expressing this idea and perpetuating in many ways this idea of a unique American exceptionalism that I think the current moment young people are now grappling with, because it doesn't make sense in the context of a lot of things that have been elevated for them in the last year. And so now's our chance to really think about how we want to be more rigorous, how we want to invite conversations about who we want young people to be, how they can show up in community, how they can understand acts of service as part of building community, not as acts of charity, how they can recognize that, probably one of the most racist things to do is to lead a trip to a land that is populated by people of color and then take pictures of children without their consent and post them all over social media and say, look, I went to go help the little Black and brown children. That is deeply insulting, and it doesn't elevate the beauty of that community itself, but rather play into the narrative of white saviorism. To go through these concepts, right? And you go through them in a way that allows young people to say, look how beautiful this community is. What you help me identify what some of these factors are that make this community resilient. Let's talk about this concept of how there has been a historical oppression, how this colonial way of being was advantageous for one group, but not necessarily for another. And that requires us to have the capacity to hold and lead those conversations. So I would not advise that educators who have not done the work to deeply interrogate and build their own capacity around these to go in and try to facilitate that. I talk about that a bit in Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, where there was an incident gone wrong, where an educator thought that she was doing something that was helpful around the conversation of American slavery, that was actually deeply harmful because she hadn't done her own preparation for that kind of assignment. So, it's really important to continue to delve into the rigors. There are many public intellectuals, public educators who help to increase some of that capacity on Instagram, various podcasts, and maybe I'll share them with the organizers of this conference if that's something that's of interest, where there's an ongoing learning community using social media to help individuals work through issues, but I think it's especially important for educators to work through as you're building out various curricula. Okay, so for 4 minutes, I'll take the last question, which is, can you comment on the intradominance that can occur within Black girl affinity groups and how to move effectively to address this when equitable norms have been attempted to be established? I think I understand this question. I think this question is about negotiating some of the power dynamics within affinity groups. There are a host of, I'm thinking of a number of ways of responding to that. So one thing that I think is really important when designing, cultivating, or engaging in affinity group spaces is to really think about how to establish from the very beginning a set of agreements that provide folks with an opportunity to address all the things that are tied to some of the historical structures of violence that impact these communities. So for this particular example of Black girl affinity groups, it would be important to establish from the onset, and if you've already started, then just say, let's do a reset and think about some of these broader issues around colorism, around age group dynamics, around body image and structures and standards of beauty, and how that informs how society has structured Black girlhood and what Black girls themselves might receive from these spaces. What the literature tells us is that, and my own experience too, but what the literature tells us is that grounding Black girls in discussions about African culture and identity and the unique way that the African diaspora has held on to certain ideas and rejected others and been informed by new cultures, all plays into how we set collective norms about how we will operationalize our engagement with each other. And holding that space just requires there to be ample opportunities for girls to express their frustrations, for girls to maybe bring a song or do a playlist that helps them articulate what they're feeling, or that invites them to bring in some of the other cultural ways of expressing what this has meant in their own lives. I think it's really important to start there, because some of the dynamics around dominance, or some of the dynamics around who gets to speak for what, and some of the tensions that might emerge are because there's not a lot of agreement often about what these terms mean, how these bigger issues impact the lives that they're living, and what they can do about it as students, and how they'll interact with each other, especially if this is at the early adolescent to late teenage years, where there's so much else going on in girls' bodies and emotions that, also handling these big issues sometimes, if you don't carefully negotiate that with them, can be an even bigger challenge. But what I love is that what we're finding is that the more that there is this grounding in these tenets and principles that ground them and connect them to their histories, their collective shared history, the more they're likely to avoid engaging in aggressive behavior, the more likely they are to partner and work with each other more collaboratively, and the more likely they are to recognize the resilience in themselves and their communities that connect them in this conversation rather than divide them. So I hope that's been helpful. And I thank you all for the chance to share some of my thoughts on these issues with you all. Denisha, I think am I turning it back to you at this point?
I think I will just end, and we're all set. But thank you so much, Dr. Morris. I know I speak for everyone on this call when I say thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us. And for everyone watching, we'll have the recording up as soon as possible. And we'll be in touch with Dr. Morris for additional resources. So thank you all.
Thank you.